I'm turning 13 this year. For most of us, that means middle school and homework. But when Magnus Carlsen was my exact age, he sat down against the most feared chess player in human history and almost ended his career. Today, I'm breaking down the game that proved age is just a number. Magnus opens with d4, the classic queen's pawn opening. Kasparov immediately matches him with d5, showing he's ready to fight for the center. Magnus offers the queen gambit with c4, but Kasparov declines, sliding his pawn to c6. This is a Slav defense. It's rock solid and famously hard to crack. Both masters bring out their knight to f3 and f6. They're fighting for every inch of space in the middle of the board. Magnus develops his second knight to c3, and Kasparov reinforces his wall with e6. We've officially entered the semi-Slav, one of the most complex openings in chess. Magnus pins the knight with bishop g5, but Kasparov just develops his other knight to d7. He's setting a trap, waiting for Magnus to slip up. Magnus opens his bishop with e3, and here it is. Kasparov strikes with queen to a5. This is the Cambridge Spring variation. He is trying to drag the 13-year-old into a psychological war before the game even really begins. Magnus realizes his knight is pinned, so he drops his other knight back to d2 to break it. Kasparov immediately responds by pinning the other knight with bishop to b4. The pressure is insane. Magnus defends with his queen to c2, and Kasparov finally tucks his king away with a castle. It's a game of chicken at this point. Magnus finishes development, but look at Kasparov. He strikes the center with e5. He wants to blow the game open while the kid's king is still in the middle. Magnus ignores the threat and castles anyway. Kasparov captures on d4, and the center of the board is a total war zone. Magnus counters by attacking the queen with knight to b3. The queen retreats, Magnus takes back in the center, and the tension is at an all-time high. Pieces start flying, Kasparov takes c4, Magnus recaptures with the bishop, and both players start maneuvering. Magnus brings his rook to e1, taking control of the most important open file on the board. Kasparov then pushes his pawn to h6, trying to attack the bishop of Magnus. Magnus retreats his bishop to h4. Kasparov slides his bishop to d6, aiming right at the h2 pawn. It looks like a deadly attack is starting, but Magnus stays stone cold. Magnus calmly pushes h3, a tiny move that asks Kasparov exactly what his plan is. Kasparov maneuvers his knight to b6, trying to create some counterplan on the queen side. But Magnus strikes first. He captures the knight on f6, shattering the pawn shield in front of Kasparov's king. Kasparov ignores the king for a second and captures the bishop on c4, trying to keep the material balanced. Magnus jumps his knight to e4. The piece is a monster, sitting right in the heart of the board. Kasparov throws a desperate check with the bishop on h2, trying to distract the 13-year-old. Magnus just steps his king to h1. He's perfectly safe in the corner. Kasparov brings his knight back to d6, hoping to trade off Magnus' powerful centralized knight. Magnus simply captures with the bishop on h2. Just like that, the kid is up a full piece against the world champion. Kasparov takes back on e4 with a check, discovering an attack on Magnus' king. Magnus blocks the check perfectly with bishop to e5. he is still dominating the position. Kasparov retreats his knight to d6, realizing his attack has completely evaporated. Magnus slides his queen to c5, pinning the knight to the rook. He's squeezing Kasparov now. Kasparov is forced to defend with rook to d8, but he's completely paralyzed. Magnus pushes to the center with pawn to d5. He's breaking open the gates. Kasparov tries to unpin his knight by moving the queen to d7. Magnus brings more reinforcements, jumping his knight to d4. All of White's pieces are attacking. Kasparov tries to trade off the pressure by moving his knight to f5. Magnus captures on c6, opening up lines of attack against the black king. Kasparov recaptures with the pawn on c6. Magnus snatches another pawn on c6 with his knight. He's up material and in total control. Kasparov's rook retreats to e8, as he's just trying to hold up his position together. Magnus brings the hammer down with rook to d1, forcing Kasparov's queen to move again. The queen moves to e6, desperately looking for some safety. Magnus doubles his power on the e-file with rook to e1. The pressure is unbearable. Magnus isn't having it. He moves his knight to d4, forcing yet another trade. The knights come off the board as Kasparov captures on d4. Magnus recaptures with the queen, keeping his eyes on the prize. Kasparov puts his queen on g6, looking for a sneaky one-move checkmate on g2. Magnus says nice try and offers a queen trade on g4. Once these queens leave the board, Kasparov's chances of winning go to zero. Kasparov accepts the trades, the biggest threats are gone, and the greatest player in history has finally escaped the 13-year-old's traps. Magnus recaptures with the pawn on g4. Kasparov immediately develops his bishop to c6, eyeing that long diagonal. Magnus solidifies his queenside with b3. Kasparov plays f6, trying to limit the scope of Magnus' bishop and solidify his king's safety. Magnus places his bishop on c3, creating a battery. Kasparov decides to trade one pair of rooks, capturing on e1. Magnus takes back with the rook, keeping control of the open file. Kasparov centralizes his bishop to d5. It's a defensive wall. Magnus moves his rook to b1, preparing to push his queenside pawns. Kasparov brings his king to f7. In the endgame, the king becomes a fighting piece. Magnus brings his king to g3, mirroring Kasparov. Kasparov swings his rook to b8, putting pressure on Magnus' b-pawn. Magnus forces the issue by pushing b4. Kasparov captures the pawn, trying to clear out the board even more. Magnus takes back with the bishop, and Kasparov repositions his bishop to c4, keeping things as annoying as possible for the kid. Magnus pushes his a-pawn to a5. This is a passed pawn. If it reaches the end, he gets a new queen. Kasparov blocks it immediately with bishop to a6. Magnus plays f3, creating a safe spot for his king. Kasparov moves his king to g6, just waiting and watching. Magnus brings his king up to f4, looking for a way to break through. Kasparov challenges him with h5, trying to chip away at Magnus' pawn structure. Magnus takes the pawn and Kasparov takes back with the king. The kings are now almost face-to-face in the middle of the board. Magnus throws a check with the rook on h1, forcing Kasparov's king to step back to g6. Magnus places his bishop on c5, but Kasparov invades with rook to b2, attacking Magnus' pawn from behind. Magnus defends with king to g3, and Kasparov's rook slides to a2, attacking that dangerous a-pawn again. Magnus defends the pawn with bishop to b6. Kasparov drops his king back to f7, staying incredibly patient. Magnus moves his rook to c1, looking for a new angle. Kasparov pushes g5, gaining space and putting Magnus' king in the box. Magnus throws another check on c7. Kasparov moves to g6. It's a complete stalemate of ideas now. Magnus plays rook to c6, pinning the pawn, but Kasparov counters with bishop to f1, threatening a checkmate on the g-pawn. Magnus is forced to play bishop to f2 to defend everything. There is no way for either players to make progress anymore. And right here, after 52 moves of pure torture, Magnus realizes the legend isn't going to break. They shake hands and agree to a draw. Magnus looks disappointed, but Kasparov practically ran out of the room. He knew he just escaped a disaster against a middle schooler. This single match changed everything. It proved that the new generation had arrived. A few years later, Magnus would go on to become the world champion himself, holding the title for over a decade. But it all started here, in this small tournament in Reykjavik, where a boy in a hoodie almost toppled the greatest player of all time. If you enjoyed this move-by-move breakdown of one of the most famous draws in history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Magnus could have won if he played the endgame differently? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.